Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. In the Shadows of November. The first time Claire saw him, the world had dissolved into a haze of rain and streetlights. The city was heavy with November's melancholy, a season of gray skies and damp leaves crushed under hurried footsteps. She had ducked into the tiny corner cafe near her apartment, desperate for warmth and a quiet corner to lose herself in a book. The bells above the door jingled softly as she entered, releasing a gust of chill air into the warm, coffee-scented haven. Inside, the cafe was intimate, its charm found in mismatched wooden chairs and a dusty record player that spun melancholy jazz tunes. It was a sanctuary from the bustling city outside. Claire ordered a caramel latte, her voice barely audible over the soft hum of conversation and the gentle clatter of ceramic cups. She chose a seat by the window, her favorite spot where she could watch the world pass by in muted colors. And then he walked in. He was tall, his dark hair dripping from the rain, his black overcoat hugging his frame as if the storm had tried to strip him bare and failed. There was something magnetic about him, an effortless grace in the way he moved, his presence commanding without being loud. His eyes, a striking shade of gray, scanned the room as if searching for something, or someone. When they landed on Claire, a flicker of recognition crossed his face, though she was certain they'd never met. Claire, ever the observer, couldn't help but study him. He was the kind of man who seemed out of place in such a modest cafe, as though he belonged to a world of grander gestures and brighter lights. Yet, he approached the counter with quiet confidence, ordered a plain black coffee, and took the seat across from her without a word of introduction. "Do you mind if I sit here?" he asked after settling in, his voice deep and warm, with a hint of an accent Claire couldn't place. She hesitated, glancing around the cafe. There were other empty seats, but something in his gaze held her captive. "No, it's fine," she replied, her tone betraying both curiosity and caution. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Claire returned to her book, or at least pretended to, but she could feel his presence like a heat radiating across the small table. He didn't seem to notice her discomfort, or perhaps he did, and found it amusing. Instead, he sipped his coffee and stared out the window, his expression unreadable. Finally, he broke the silence. "Do you always read books with tragic endings?" Claire blinked, startled by the question. She glanced down at the worn cover of Anna Karenina in her hands. "I don't seek them out," she replied, her voice firmer this time. "But I think there's something beautiful about them. They're honest." He tilted his head, considering her words. "Honest, maybe, but isn't life hard enough without adding someone else's misery to it?" His question lingered in the air between them, heavy and rhetorical. Claire felt an odd mix of irritation and intrigue. "Sometimes it helps to know you're not the only one struggling," she said. "And sometimes it's just nice to lose yourself in someone else's world, even if it's a tragic one." He smiled then, a small, fleeting curve of his lips that softened the sharp angles of his face. Fair enough. The conversation might have ended there if not for the strange familiarity Claire felt, the inexplicable sense that this wasn't their first meeting. "Have we met before?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. His smile faded, replaced by an unreadable expression. "Not officially," he said, his tone evasive. "But I've seen you around. You walk through the park every morning, don't you? With that little black notebook." Claire's breath caught. It was true. She did take morning walks through the park, scribbling poems and thoughts in her notebook. But how could he have known that? She studied him more closely, searching for some memory that would place him in her life, but he remained an enigma. "Are you a stalker, then?" she asked lightly, though her heart raced. He chuckled, the sound low and rich. "Not quite. I live nearby. Sometimes I see you on my way to work. You look lost in thought. I always wondered what you were writing." Claire relaxed slightly, though the air between them crackled with tension. She wasn't sure whether to feel flattered or wary. "Just poems," she said, her voice quieter now. "Nothing worth reading." "Poetry is always worth reading," he replied. "Even the bad ones." There was something disarming about his candor, and Claire found herself smiling despite her initial reservations. They talked for a while longer, their conversation shifting from poetry to books, from the city to the storm outside. Time slipped away unnoticed, and when she finally glanced at her watch, she was startled to see how late it had become. "I should go," she said reluctantly, gathering her things. "Wait." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. "I don't usually do this, but would you let me read one of your poems?" Claire hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect her private thoughts and the strange pull she felt toward him. Finally, she nodded and handed him a page she had torn from her notebook earlier that day. His fingers brushed hers as he took it, and the contact sent a jolt of electricity through her. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. "I'll take care of it." As she stepped back into the rain, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter had been anything but ordinary. She glanced back through the cafe window, but he was already gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of coffee and mystery. And so began a story that neither of them could have anticipated. A story of love and loss, of connection and regret, written in the shadows of November. Chapter 2: Fragments of a Stranger. The following morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the city draped in mist. Claire's routine remained unchanged. Her notebook tucked under her arm, a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, and her steps leading her toward the park. Yet everything felt different. She couldn't stop thinking about the stranger from the cafe. His presence lingered in her mind, a quiet echo that refused to fade. She chose her usual bench beneath the skeletal branches of an old oak tree. The park was nearly empty, save for the occasional jogger or dog walker. Claire opened her notebook, but instead of writing, she found herself staring at the blank page, her thoughts drawn back to the man's gray eyes and the way he had spoken, as if he knew her better than she knew herself. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice him approaching until he was standing in front of her, the same black coat draped over his shoulders. "Good morning," he said, his voice as calm and steady as the day before. Claire's heart jumped, but she kept her composure. "Do you always surprise people like this?" His lips twitched into a faint smile. "Only when I know they'll be here." She closed her notebook, raising an eyebrow. "So you are stalking me." "I prefer the term coincidence," he replied smoothly. "But if it bothers you, I'll leave." Claire hesitated. She should have told him to go, but instead she found herself gesturing toward the empty space on the bench. "You're already here. Might as well sit." He did, his movements measured and deliberate, as if he were aware of how much space he was taking up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city were distant here, muffled by the trees and the damp earth. Claire felt an odd sense of peace, despite the stranger's unsettling familiarity. "I read your poem," he said, breaking the silence. Her stomach tightened. She had almost forgotten about the page she'd given him. "And?" "It was beautiful," he said simply, "but sad, like you were trying to capture something you'd already lost." His words cut through her defenses like a blade. She turned to him, her expression carefully neutral. "You got all that from a few lines?" "I've always been good at reading between them," he said, his gaze steady. Claire didn't know how to respond. Her poetry was a private outlet, a way to process emotions she rarely shared with others. The idea that he had seen something so raw and personal made her feel exposed, yet strangely understood. "You never told me your name," she said finally, deflecting the conversation. "Elias," he said, offering his hand. She hesitated before taking it. His grip was firm but not overpowering, his skin warm despite the chill in the air. "Claire." "It suits you," Elias said, releasing her hand. "You don't even know me," she countered, though her voice lacked its usual edge. "Not yet," he admitted, "but I'd like to." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. There was no trace of arrogance, no indication that he was playing a game. For reasons she couldn't explain, Claire found herself wanting to let him in, to uncover the mystery that surrounded him. "So what's your story?" she asked, crossing her arms. "You can't just appear out of nowhere and act like you've known me forever." Elias leaned back, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "There's not much to tell," he said. "I moved to the city a few months ago. I work in architecture. Most days I spend more time designing other people's dreams than living my own." Claire studied him, searching for cracks in his carefully crafted persona. "And watching strangers in the park? Is that part of the job description?" Only the interesting ones, he said, his tone teasing. Despite herself, Claire smiled. She couldn't remember the last time someone had made her feel like this, off balance yet completely at ease. It was as though Elias existed outside the boundaries of her carefully ordered life, drawing her into a world she didn't fully understand, but was desperate to explore. They talked until the sun burned away the last traces of mist, their conversation weaving between light-hearted banter and deeper confessions. Claire told him about her love of poetry and her struggles to feel at home in the city. Elias shared stories of his childhood, painting vivid pictures of a small seaside town far removed from the urban chaos they now called home. By the time they parted ways, Claire felt as though she had known Elias for years. Yet when she returned to her apartment and replayed their conversation in her mind, she realized how little she actually knew about him. There was an elusiveness to him, a sense that he was holding something back. That night, as she lay in bed, Claire opened her notebook and began to write. The words flowed effortlessly, capturing the strange connection she felt with Elias and the questions he left unanswered. When she finally set her pen down, she stared at the page, her chest tight with a mix of excitement and unease. For the first time in years, Claire felt like the protagonist of her own story. But as she closed her eyes, a nagging thought crept into her mind. Every story has an ending, and not all of them are happy. Chapter 3, Whispers of Truth. Days turned into weeks, and Claire found herself thinking about Elias more than she cared to admit. Their conversations became a routine of sorts, mornings in the park, afternoons in the cafe, and once, a quiet walk along the riverbank as the city lights flickered like distant stars. Elias was always attentive, always curious, yet he remained an enigma. Claire tried not to pry, but her curiosity grew. He never mentioned friends or family, never spoke of his plans beyond the immediate. It was as if his life outside of their moments together didn't exist. And though she felt drawn to him, a part of her wondered if she was chasing shadows. One particularly cold morning, the first snow of the season dusted the park. Claire arrived at their bench to find Elias already there, his black coat speckled with flakes. He was sketching in a notebook, his movements quick and deliberate. "I didn't know you draw," she said, sitting down beside him. He glanced up, offering her a small smile. "There's a lot you don't know about me." "Clearly," she said, tilting her head to catch a glimpse of his work. The sketch was intricate, a detailed rendering of the park as seen from their bench. It wasn't just accurate, it was alive, every line imbued with emotion. "It's beautiful," Claire said softly. "You never told me you were an artist." "I'm not," Elias said, closing the notebook. "Just someone who likes to capture moments before they disappear." His words struck a chord, but before Claire could respond, he changed the subject. "What about you? Have you written anything new?" She hesitated. Lately, her poetry had taken on a new tone, darker, more introspective. Elias had become her muse in ways she didn't fully understand, and she wasn't sure she wanted him to see that side of her. "Nothing worth sharing," she said lightly. Elias raised an eyebrow but didn't press her. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the page she had given him weeks ago. It was folded neatly, the edges worn from being handled. "Why do you still have that?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. "Because it reminds me of you," he said simply. His honesty left her momentarily speechless. She looked away, the weight of his gaze too much to bear. "What are you afraid of, Claire?" he asked, his tone gentle. "I'm not afraid," she said, though her voice wavered. "Yes, you are," he said softly. "I see it in the way you hold back, the way you deflect when things get too real. You're afraid of letting someone in." His words cut deeper than she expected. "And what about you?" she countered. "You act like you're some open book, but I don't know anything about you, Elias. Not really." For the first time, his composure faltered. He looked down, his hands tightening around the notebook. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost hesitant. "There are things I can't tell you," he said. "Not yet." Claire frowned. "Why not?" "Because I don't want to hurt you." The raw emotion in his voice sent a chill through her. "You're not making any sense," she said, her frustration mounting. "If you want me to trust you, you have to be honest with me." Elias looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a sadness she couldn't comprehend. "I am honest," he said. Just not about everything. The tension between them was palpable. Claire wanted to push him, to demand answers, but something in his expression stopped her. He looked like a man on the edge of a precipice, caught between holding on and letting go. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll wait, but don't expect me to keep chasing after someone who won't meet me halfway." Elias nodded, his jaw tight. "Fair enough." They sat in silence for a while, the snow falling softly around them. Claire felt the distance between them growing, an invisible wall she couldn't break through, and yet she couldn't bring herself to walk away. When they finally parted, Elias pressed the folded page of her poem into her hand. "Hold on to this," he said. "You'll need it more than I will." His words lingered long after he disappeared into the snowy streets, leaving Claire alone with more questions than answers. That night, she read the poem she had written for him, her own words feeling foreign and distant. She wondered what Elias wasn't telling her, what secrets he carried that made him so reluctant to let her in. But more than anything, she wondered if their story would ever find its way to the light, or if it was destined to remain a shadow of what could have been. Chapter 4. The Weight of Secrets. The city felt heavier after that morning in the park, as if Elias's unspoken truths had draped the world in an invisible shroud. Claire walked through her days distracted, replaying their conversation in her mind, searching for clues she might have missed. She hated the way her life had started to orbit around him. Yet every time she resolved to pull away, she found herself drawn closer, like a moth to a flame she knew could burn her. One evening, weeks later, Elias surprised her again. Claire had been walking home from work, the streets alive with holiday lights and the faint buzz of laughter spilling from nearby pubs. The air was sharp with the first real chill of winter, her breath visible in the glow of lampposts. She turned a corner near the cafe where they'd first met and found him waiting, leaning casually against the brick wall as if he'd been there for hours. "You're late," he said. His voice warmed despite the cold. "I didn't know we had plans," she replied, trying to mask her surprise. "We don't, but I need to show you something." Claire hesitated, her instincts torn between caution and curiosity. "Show me what?" Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his gray eyes searching hers. "You said you wanted honesty," he said softly. "I think it's time." Her heart skipped a beat. She nodded, her curiosity winning out. "Lead the way." They walked in silence through the city's quieter streets, the hum of traffic fading as they ventured into unfamiliar territory. Claire couldn't help but notice how different Elias seemed. Less guarded, yet more intense. His usual teasing demeanor was replaced with a quiet determination that made her both anxious and intrigued. Finally, they arrived at an old, weathered building on the edge of the city. Its facade was cracked, the windows darkened, but it had a strange charm, as if it held stories too vast to tell. Elias led her inside without a word, the creak of the door echoing through the empty space. The interior was sparse, lit only by the faint glow of a single desk lamp. Papers and sketches were scattered across a wooden table in the center of the room, and a small heater hummed in the corner. "This is where you work?" Claire asked, taking in the space. "Sometimes," Elias said, his voice distant. "But it's more than that. This is where I figure things out." He motioned for her to sit, but Claire remained standing, her nerves on edge. "Elias, what's going on? Why did you bring me here?" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. For the first time since they'd met, he looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. "You're right," he said finally. "You don't know me. Not really. And I've been avoiding telling you the truth because I didn't want to lose you, but keeping it from you isn't fair." Claire crossed her arms, her chest tight. "Just say it, Elias. Whatever it is, I can handle it." He met her gaze, and in that moment she saw the weight of everything he'd been carrying. "I lied about why I came to this city," he began. "It wasn't for work. It was to disappear." "Disappear?" Claire repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I left my old life behind," he continued. "The people I knew, the person I used to be. There were mistakes, things I couldn't fix. Coming here was my way of starting over, of trying to be someone different, someone better." Claire's mind raced, her pulse quickening. "What kind of mistakes?" Elias looked away, his jaw tightening. "I can't tell you everything. Not yet. But what you need to know is that I'm not the man you think I am. And if you stay close to me, you might get hurt." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "So what are you saying? That I should walk away?" "I'm saying you deserve the choice," he said quietly. "I don't want to pull you into something you don't understand. But if you stay, it's not going to be easy." Claire stared at him, her emotions a tangled mess. Part of her wanted to demand answers, to force him to lay bare whatever secrets he was hiding. But another part, the part that had fallen for him despite her better judgment, couldn't bring herself to let him go. "I don't need easy," she said finally, her voice steady. "I just need the truth." Elias's expression softened, and for the first time she saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Then I'll tell you," he said, "but not all at once. Some things take time." Claire nodded, her heart heavy but resolute. "Okay, but don't make me regret this." "I won't," Elias promised. "I'll prove it to you." As they left the building together, the night felt colder, the world sharper. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just stepped onto a path she couldn't turn back from. Whatever Elias's secrets were, they had already begun to unravel her carefully constructed life. And as much as she hated to admit it, she wasn't sure she wanted to stop. Final chapter, the breaking point. The snow fell heavier as December deepened, blanketing the city in a deceptive quiet. Weeks had passed since that night in the old building, and though Claire and Elias continued to meet, their connection felt fragile, stretched thin by the weight of what remained unspoken. Elias kept his promise to be honest, though his truths were delivered in fragments, each one more haunting than the last. He told her about his life in a distant city, where ambition had consumed him, leading to choices he could never undo. He spoke of betrayal, of debts owed and bridges burned, of a reckoning that had forced him to flee. But there were gaps in his story. Moments where he would falter, his words trailing off into silence. Claire didn't push, though every omission felt like a splinter in her heart. She told herself she could handle it, that she didn't need to know everything to love him. But love, she realized, wasn't always enough. One evening, just days before Christmas, Claire found herself waiting for Elias in the cafe where they had first met. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and cinnamon, the chatter of customers blending with the faint hum of holiday music. She stared at the folded page of her poem, now wrinkled and worn, lying on the table before her. Elias was late. He was never late. She checked her phone, her stomach twisting with unease. There were no messages, no missed calls. The cafe felt stifling, the warmth oppressive, and she stepped outside, the cold air biting at her cheeks. "Claire?" She turned at the sound of his voice, relief flooding her for a brief moment before she saw his expression. Elias looked haggard, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite place, fear, regret, perhaps both. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I need you to come with me," he said, his tone urgent. "Elias, what's going on?" "There's no time to explain," he said, grabbing her hand. "Please, just trust me." Against her better judgment, she followed him. He led her through the snow-covered streets, his grip on her hand firm but not reassuring. They stopped in an alley near the outskirts of the city, the faint glow of a street lamp casting long shadows against the brick walls. "Why are we here?" Claire demanded, her breath visible in the frigid air. Elias turned to her, his face pale. "Because it's not safe for you anymore." The words hit her like a blow. "What are you talking about? Safe from what?" "From me," he said, his voice breaking. "I tried to keep you out of this, but I failed. They know about you, Claire." "Who?" she asked, panic rising in her chest. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and handed her an envelope. "Take this. Inside is everything you need to leave. Money, a ticket, instructions. You have to go now." Claire stared at him, her mind reeling. "You can't be serious. I'm not leaving you." "You have to," Elias said, his voice filled with desperation. "If you stay, they'll use you against me. And I can't." He stopped, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair. "I can't lose you, Claire. Not like this." She felt tears sting her eyes. "You think I care about your past? About whatever mess you're running from? I chose to stay, Elias. I chose you. And I chose to protect you," he said fiercely, "even if it means letting you go." Claire's heart shattered at his words, but before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the alley. Elias stiffened, his body tense like a coiled spring. Go, he whispered urgently, pushing the envelope into her hands. What about you? She asked, her voice breaking. I'll handle it, he said. Just promise me you'll get out of the city. Promise me you'll be safe. Claire hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to stay, to fight for him. But the look in his eyes told her there was no time, no choice. I promise, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. Elias nodded, his jaw tight. Good. Now run. She turned and ran, the sound of her footsteps merging with the pounding of her heart. Behind her she heard voices, angry and sharp, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. When she finally reached her apartment, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely open the envelope. Inside, she found a wad of cash, a train ticket, and a letter written in Elias's precise handwriting. Claire, if you're reading this, it means you did as I asked. Thank you for trusting me, even when I didn't deserve it. I don't know if I'll ever see you again, but I need you to know that meeting you changed everything for me. You made me want to be better, to be someone worthy of love. I'm sorry I couldn't give you the ending you deserved. Claire clutched the letter to her chest, her tears soaking the paper. She wanted to scream, to fight, to run back to him, but she knew it was too late. Elias had made his choice, and now she had to make hers. 2 days later, Claire boarded the train, her heart heavy with the weight of what she was leaving behind. As the city faded into the distance, she whispered a silent prayer for Elias, hoping he would find his way back to the light. But deep down, she knew some stories were never meant to have happy endings. Chapter 1. A Glimpse of Forever. The autumn air in the small town of Westbrook was crisp, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. The sky above was overcast, with thick clouds that hung low and heavy, like a blanket that threatened to smother the fading light of the day. Arjun walked along the narrow path that wound through the park, his boots crunching softly on the gravel beneath him. He had always found peace in these moments of solitude, the quiet rhythm of his footsteps his only companion. But today, something was different. There was an odd heaviness in the air, an invisible presence that made his heart feel uneasy. As he rounded the bend by the old oak tree, he saw her, Dia. She stood by the water's edge, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, the strands dancing in the wind like the flickering flames of a candle. She was staring out at the river, lost in thought, her expression distant, almost melancholic. Arjun had known her since childhood, but he had never seen her like this before. There was a vulnerability to her, a sadness in the way she held herself, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her delicate frame. He hesitated for a moment, unsure whether he should approach. They hadn't spoken in weeks, ever since the night at the bonfire, when everything between them had changed. That night, Dia had smiled at him in a way that made his heart race, as if for the first time she had seen him as more than just a friend. They had shared a quiet conversation under the stars, their voices soft and tentative, like two people testing the waters of something new. It had felt perfect. But then, just as quickly as the moment had blossomed, it had faded. Dia had pulled away, her eyes clouded with something that Arjun couldn't quite understand. She had said nothing, only smiled faintly and walked away, leaving him standing there, bewildered and heartbroken. Since then, the distance between them had only grown. She was always polite, always kind, but there was a coldness in her that hadn't been there before. And Arjun, too, had changed. His feelings for her had deepened in a way he hadn't expected. He found himself watching her from afar, his heart aching every time their eyes met, every time she smiled at someone else. But he never dared to cross that line, to ask her what had happened, to risk destroying whatever fragile bond they had left. As he took a few steps toward her, Dia turned, her gaze meeting his. For a brief moment the world seemed to stand still. It was as if time itself had stopped, holding its breath in anticipation. And then, with a small sigh, Dia smiled. A smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She stepped forward, the sound of her soft footsteps mingling with the rustle of the leaves around them. "Hey," she said, her voice barely a whisper, as if she was afraid to speak too loudly, afraid to disturb the delicate balance between them. Arjun felt his heart skip a beat. He smiled back, though the warmth of it didn't quite touch his eyes either. "Hey," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "What are you doing here?" Dia shrugged, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. "Just thinking, about everything." Arjun nodded, though he had no idea what she meant. He wanted to ask her what was wrong, to ask if she was okay, but the words stuck in his throat. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was the opposite. He cared too much, and that made everything harder. "I've been thinking too," he said instead, his voice softer now. "About us." Daya's eyes flickered for a moment, and she glanced away as though the words had struck a nerve. "Arjun," she started, her tone uncertain, "I don't know if we should." Her voice trailed off, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink, the air thickening with unspoken tension. Arjun's heart clenched, but he refused to look away. He had to know. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. "Dia, what happened?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Why did you pull away? Did I do something wrong?" She bit her lip, her eyes darting back to him. She was searching for the right words, but they seemed to evade her, just out of reach. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It's not you. It's me. She paused, as if trying to find a way to explain something that was too painful to put into words. Arjun's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He took a step closer, his breath catching in his throat. "What do you mean? Please, Dia. I don't understand." She took a deep breath, her shoulders slumping. "I'm leaving. I'm moving to the city next week." The words hit him like a blow, and for a moment, Arjun couldn't breathe. "What? No, you can't." "I have to. It's the only way I can move forward, to find something more. I can't stay here, not like this." Arjun's world tilted, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur around him. The park, the river, even Daya's face. It all faded into a dull haze. "But what about us? What about what we had?" His voice was barely audible, a fragile whisper against the growing distance between them. Dia looked at him, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I thought I knew what I wanted, Arjun. But I don't. And I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when I know it's not." Arjun took a step back, his mind racing. "So that's it? You're just gonna leave? After everything?" "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling now. "I never meant to hurt you. I care about you. But I can't do this anymore." He stood there in silence, the weight of her words crushing him. His heart ached in a way he hadn't thought possible, a deep, gnawing pain that seemed to seep into every part of him. He had never felt more helpless, more powerless to change anything. "I guess this is goodbye then," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of acceptance, of defeat. Dia nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Goodbye, Arjun." And with that, she turned and walked away, the distance between them growing with each step, until she was nothing more than a shadow in the fading light of the day. Arjun stood there, rooted to the spot, watching her disappear into the distance. His heart shattered, and the world around him seemed to fade into an endless gray. This chapter sets up the sadness and tension of the story, hinting at the heartbreak in the distance that will follow. Chapter 2. Echoes of What Could Have Been. The days after Dia's departure felt like an endless blur. Arjun found himself waking up to a world that seemed to have lost its color, its meaning. The once familiar streets of Westbrook, with its narrow lanes and quaint houses, now felt suffocating. He passed by the old oak tree in the park, where he had last seen her, but it no longer brought him peace. It only reminded him of that moment, at the last time their paths had crossed. He kept replaying their final conversation in his mind, each word echoing in his thoughts like a relentless drumbeat. "I thought I knew what I wanted." Her voice lingered in his head, each syllable a dagger in his chest. She had never said the words that he had needed to hear, the ones that would have made sense of everything, the ones that would have told him why she had pulled away, why she had chosen to leave. Instead, she had vanished from his life as quietly as she had entered it, leaving only an empty space where once there had been hope. Arjun tried to distract himself, to lose himself in the monotony of his day-to-day life. He threw himself into his studies, his textbooks and lab reports, his only escape from the storm of emotions that raged inside him. But even that didn't work. He found his mind wandering during lectures, the words of his professors blurring into meaningless murmurs as his thoughts drifted back to her. He would close his eyes for just a moment, and there she was, smiling at him from across the room, laughing at a joke he had made, her eyes sparkling with a warmth that seemed to belong only to them. But those moments were gone, and all he was left with were the memories. One evening, a week after Dia's departure, Arjun found himself at the local cafe, staring into his coffee cup as he absent-mindedly stirred it. The cafe was quiet, the low murmur of conversation blending with the soft jazz music playing in the background. He had come here to clear his head, to break the cycle of his thoughts, but as he looked around, he saw nothing but reminders of her. It was there, in the corner of the cafe, that he saw her. Or rather, saw the shadow of what had once been her. A girl with dark hair sitting with a group of friends, laughing softly at something one of them had said. Her laughter was the same, soft, melodic, like the tinkling of a bell. Her eyes, however, were different. They no longer held that spark, that intensity that Arjun had once known. Instead, they seemed dull, distant, as if her spirit had faded into something else entirely. The girl wasn't Dia, but for a brief moment it felt as though she was. The resemblance was uncanny. The way she tilted her head when she laughed, the way her fingers drummed absent-mindedly on the table, but it was just an illusion. Dia was gone. Arjun's heart clenched, and he quickly looked away, focusing on the dark liquid in his cup, trying to push away the pain that threatened to rise up again. He had no right to mourn her anymore. She had made her decision. She had chosen the city, the future she thought she could build without him. And now, he had to learn to live without her. But the thought of her, of what they had been, gnawed at him every day. He found himself checking his phone every few minutes, hoping for a message, a sign that she hadn't completely erased him from her life. But the screen remained empty, her name no longer appearing in his inbox. Even when he did see her on social media, it was as though she had become a stranger, a version of herself that no longer fit the person he had known. As the days passed, the emptiness inside him grew. The quiet spaces between his thoughts became louder, filled with the echo of everything he had lost. Arjun's friends noticed the change in him. He had always been quiet, reserved, but now there was an almost painful stillness about him. They tried to reach out, to offer distractions, but nothing seemed to help. One evening, as he sat in the park, staring out over the water, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Startled, he turned to see his friend Raj, standing beside him, looking down with concern. "You've been quiet lately," Raj said, his voice gentle. "You haven't been yourself, Arjun. What's going on?" Arjun didn't answer at first. He didn't want to talk about Dia, didn't want to share the ache that had become his constant companion. But Raj's gaze was persistent, kind, and for some reason, Arjun found himself speaking. "I can't stop thinking about her," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Raj nodded, his expression softening. "I know, but you can't keep doing this to yourself. You have to move on, Arjun. She's gone." "I know," Arjun replied, his voice cracking. "I know she's gone, but it doesn't make it any easier." "Sometimes it's not about making it easier," Raj said quietly. "It's about accepting it, letting go." Arjun didn't respond. He didn't know how to. He had tried to let go, to forget, but it felt like trying to forget how to breathe. The days turned into weeks, and Arjun slowly began to accept the truth, though it was a truth he wasn't ready to face. Dia was gone. She had moved on, and no amount of longing, no amount of wishing for a different outcome could bring her back. He found himself walking past the park every day, his eyes lingering on the bench where they had once sat together, talking about their dreams and fears as the sun set behind them. That bench was now empty, a silent witness to the passage of time, to the fading of what could have been. And yet, as much as he tried to bury the pain, as much as he told himself that he would heal, there were moments when the memory of her would rise up, like a storm from the depths of his soul. The way she had looked at him that night, the way she had laughed, the way she had held his hand as if she had never wanted to let go. It all felt like a dream now, a dream that he could never return to. In this second chapter, Arjun struggles with the painful reality of Dia's absence, trying to cope with the loss while also grappling with his own sense of guilt and longing. Chapter 3. The Weight of Silence. Months had passed since Dia left, and the winter in Westbrook had arrived with an unrelenting chill. The town, once bathed in the golden hues of autumn, now wore a blanket of gray, with snow falling in soft, unbroken sheets that covered the streets, the houses, and even the once vibrant park. Arjun could hardly remember what it felt like to see the world in color, to feel the warmth of sunlight on his skin. Everything felt muted, as though he were walking through life in a haze, unable to escape the icy grip of grief. He had tried to move on, as Raj had suggested, but it was harder than he had imagined. Time had not been a healer. Instead, it had only deepened the ache in his chest. There were moments, like when he would walk past the cafe where they had spent so many afternoons talking, laughing. The weight of her absence would hit him anew. There was no escaping it. Every corner of the town seemed to carry the imprint of her. Even his thoughts of her had become more distant, more painful. He no longer remembered her smile with the warmth it had once carried. Instead, it was as if the memory of her had become twisted, suffused with a quiet sadness that threatened to overwhelm him. The laughter they had shared felt like a distant echo, fading with each passing day. One particularly cold evening, Arjun sat alone in his room, staring out the window at the falling snow. His phone lay on the desk beside him, the screen dark, its silence a constant reminder of the void in his life. He had stopped checking it for messages from her long ago. He had stopped hoping. Yet, there were nights like this, when he would find himself reaching for it, his thumb hovering over her name, wondering if it would be foolish to send just one message, to ask how she was, to see if she still thought of him. But he never sent anything. He couldn't bring himself to do it. The distance between them had grown too wide, the silence too deep. She had chosen her path, and he had to respect that. He picked up a book from his desk, something to occupy his mind, but the words blurred before his eyes. The pages of the book felt like the pages of his life, blank, void of meaning. He had always been a driven person, focused on his studies, his future, but now nothing seemed to matter. He had no clear direction, no purpose. The phone vibrated on the desk, pulling Arjun from his thoughts. He stared at it, his heart leaping in his chest as he saw the name on the screen. Dia! He didn't know whether to be excited or afraid. His fingers trembled as he answered, unsure of what to expect. The line was quiet for a moment, and then he heard her voice. Arjun? Her voice was soft, tentative, as if she wasn't sure if he would pick up. His heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. Dia, it's been a while. I know, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize, Arjun interrupted, his tone gentle. It's okay, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I wasn't sure if I should call, Dia admitted, a small laugh escaping her. I've been thinking about you a lot, about everything, and I needed to hear your voice. Arjun swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking deep into his chest. He hadn't realized how much he had missed her voice, the way it used to bring him comfort, even in the darkest moments. He wanted to say something, to ask her why she was calling, why now, but the words eluded him. Instead, he said the only thing that made sense. Why now? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. There was a long pause, the silence between them heavy with unspoken truths. I don't know. I've been feeling lost, Arjun. I thought moving away would make things easier, but it didn't. It only made it harder. I've been trying to find myself, trying to figure things out, but every time I close my eyes, I see you. I see us. And it hurts. Arjun closed his eyes, his breath catching in his throat. I've been trying to move on, Dia. It hasn't been easy, but I've been trying. I know. I can't even imagine what it's been like for you, she said softly. I'm sorry for that, too. I never meant to hurt you. I wasn't ready. I still don't know if I am. He could hear the uncertainty in her voice, the same uncertainty that had driven her away all those months ago. Dia, it's not that simple. You can't just come back and expect things to go back to how they were. I know, she whispered. I don't want things to go back to how they were. I don't think that's possible. But I want to know if there's still a chance for us. A chance for me to make things right. Arjun's heart felt as though it might break in two. Her words were both a balm and a blade, offering him the hope he had long buried, while also ripping open the wound he had tried so desperately to heal. He had spent so many nights wishing for this moment, wishing that she would come back, that she would realize how much he still cared. But now that it was happening, he didn't know how to respond. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can just forget everything, Dia. I've spent so much time trying to let go, to move on, and I don't know if I'm ready to open myself up to you again." She was silent for a long time, and Arjun could hear her breathing softly on the other end of the line. "I understand," she said at last. I needed you to know. I needed you to know that I think about you every day, that I regret not being braver, not being honest with you." Arjun's heart clenched. He had always known that Dia was afraid of the depth of their connection, afraid of what it might mean for her future. But hearing her admit it, hearing her acknowledge the pain she had caused, made him realize just how much he had been holding on to. "I wish things were different," he whispered, the words slipping from his mouth before he could stop them. "I do too," Dia replied, her voice trembling. "But maybe it's too late." The finality of her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Arjun closed his eyes, trying to keep his composure. "Maybe it is," he said softly. "Maybe we've both moved on in different ways." There was no bitterness in his voice, no anger, only a deep, overwhelming sadness. Because he knew, deep down, that it was true. Dia had changed. He had changed. And no matter how much they might want to turn back time, they could never go back to who they once were. "I guess this is goodbye, then," Dia said quietly. Arjun nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Goodbye, Dia." The line went dead. Arjun sat in the silence, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him, crushing him with its finality. He had waited for this moment for so long, and now that it had come, it felt like the end of everything. The end of a love that had once seemed so bright, so full of possibility. And now it was just a memory, slipping further and further away with each passing day. Chapter 4. The Weight of Letting Go. The weeks following Dia's call felt like a strange kind of limbo for Arjun. He had spent so long holding on to the hope that she would return, that they would find a way back to each other. But now, after the finality of their conversation, there was nothing left but the harsh truth of their separation. He found himself adrift, as if the anchor that had once kept him grounded had been ripped away, and he was left floating in a sea of uncertainty. His routine remained the same, attending classes, meeting friends, working on assignments. But there was a hollow feeling inside him, as though everything he did was devoid of meaning. The laughter of his friends, the noise of campus life, it all felt distant, as though he were living in a world that no longer made sense. Nothing seemed to matter anymore, not in the way it used to. It was the first week of December, and the cold had settled in fully, the air sharp and biting as Arjun walked across campus. The familiar walkways, lined with trees that were now bare, had once been the backdrop of countless moments shared with Dia. They had walked these paths together, talked about their futures, their hopes, their fears. And now, those memories haunted him, like ghosts of a life he could no longer have. He had made the decision to stop checking his phone. Dia had made it clear that she wasn't ready to try again, that they both needed time apart, and Arjun had to accept that. But every time he saw someone pull out their phone, every time his screen lit up with a new message notification, his heart would skip a beat. He couldn't help it. Even when he knew she wouldn't reach out, a part of him still hoped, still clung to that fleeting possibility. It was one evening, as he sat in the library, surrounded by the hum of students studying and the smell of old books, that he received a message. His heart lurched in his chest as he opened it. The message was from a number he didn't recognize, but as soon as he read the words, he knew. It was her. "I need to see you. Can we talk?" Arjun's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing. What did this mean? Was she really ready to try again? Or was it something else? Something that would leave him with more questions than answers. His hands shook as he typed his reply. "Where?" The message came through almost immediately. "I'll meet you at the park where we used to go. Same place, same time. Please, Arjun." Arjun didn't know what to feel. Part of him wanted to run, to stay away from the pain, from the possibility of reopening old wounds. But another part of him, the part that had never truly let go of her, wanted to go to that place, to see her again, to hear her voice and maybe, just maybe, find the closure he had been seeking. He stood up abruptly, closing the textbook he had been pretending to read. He didn't need to think any longer. He didn't need to prepare. The decision had already been made. The park was eerily quiet when he arrived. The snow had fallen in thick, heavy layers, covering the ground in a blanket of white. The bare trees looked like skeletal hands reaching into the sky, their branches stark against the pale winter light. He walked through the park, his breath visible in the frigid air, and made his way to the bench, the same one where they had shared so many moments. And there she was. Dia stood there, her back to him at first, looking out over the frozen pond. She wore a long coat, her dark hair blowing slightly in the cold wind. She looked different. More mature, perhaps, but also smaller, as if the weight of everything that had happened had made her seem fragile. When she turned to face him, Arjun's heart stilled. Her eyes were red-rimmed, as though she had been crying, but there was something in her expression, something that made him hesitate. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't angry. She was just tired. "Arjun," she said softly, her voice trembling, "thank you for coming." Arjun didn't know what to say. He couldn't bring himself to ask the questions that had been swirling in his mind for so long. Instead, he nodded, his throat tight. "Why did you want to meet?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dia took a step closer, her hands clasped in front of her. She seemed so small, so distant, and yet her presence felt like it was consuming him. "I needed to see you. I needed to apologize," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought that if I left, I could forget about everything. Well, I thought that maybe, just maybe, I could move on and stop feeling the way I did when I was with you. But I was wrong. So wrong." Arjun didn't know what to say. He wanted to tell her that it was okay, that he understood, that he had been in the same place, feeling the same way. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stood there, silent, waiting for her to continue. "I left because I was scared," Dia said, her voice quieter now. "I was scared of what I felt for you, scared of how much I needed you, and I didn't know how to handle it. And in doing so, I hurt you, and I'm sorry." Her words hit him like a punch to the chest. She had always been afraid, always uncertain, but hearing her admit it out loud, hearing her say that she had hurt him, made the pain feel even sharper. "Dia," Arjun began, his voice thick with emotion, "I can't just forget all of this. I can't just pretend like it didn't matter. I tried to move on, but I couldn't. I couldn't let go of you. And now, after all this time, it feels like you're asking me to do it all over again." Dia's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out for his hand. "I don't want you to forget. I don't want you to move on. I want you to know that I never stopped caring about you, and I wish I could take back everything that happened." Arjun felt a pang in his chest. Her touch, so familiar, sent a rush of memories flooding back. The warmth of her hand in his, the way she had looked at him when she said she loved him. The connection between them had always been undeniable, and even now, standing here, it still felt like it was there, like it had never really gone away. But despite the ache in his chest, despite the pull he felt to reach out and hold her again, Arjun knew that some things were meant to stay broken. Their time had passed. The love they once had been beautiful, but it was now a memory he could never get back, no matter how hard he tried. "I think it's time for us to let go, Dia," he said quietly, his voice trembling with finality. Dia's hand fell away from his, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The wind blew through the trees, carrying with it the scent of winter, the weight of everything they had lost. Finally, Dia nodded, her shoulders slumping with the realization of what they both knew had to happen. "I understand," she whispered. They stood there for a long time, two people who once meant everything to each other, now standing in the cold with nothing left but the silence between them. "Goodbye, Arjun," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the wind. Arjun turned away, his heart breaking in two, and began to walk back through the snow-covered park, the weight of their parting settling over him like the heavy, unrelenting blanket of winter. In this chapter, Arjun and Dia come face to face with the reality that despite their feelings for each other, their paths have diverged too far to ever reconnect. Final chapter. The bittersweetness of goodbye. The weeks after that final meeting in the park felt like a slow descent into a quiet kind of solitude. Arjun had thought that seeing Dia again would bring him the closure he so desperately needed. But instead, it had only left him with more questions and more pain. He had done what he thought was best, let her go, respected her decision, and walked away. But every day felt like a struggle to move forward, to find meaning in a world that no longer included her. The days blurred together. Finals came and went, as did the fleeting moments of joy that once had filled his life. He had become a ghost of the person he once was, walking through his studies, his friendships, but never fully present. The weight of the past, of Dia, of what could have been, was always there, lurking in the background, a constant reminder of everything he had lost. Even now, as winter gave way to spring, and the days grew longer, there was no real change. Arjun didn't feel the excitement of a new season, the way the sun warmed the earth and brought everything back to life. Instead, there was only a numbness, a kind of resignation that had settled over him. He still found himself walking by the places they had once visited, the cafe, the park, the streets where they had spent their late-night walks. But now, these places were empty, hollow, no longer filled with the sounds of laughter and promise, but with an overwhelming silence. It was one afternoon, as he sat in the student lounge scrolling mindlessly through his phone, that he saw it. A picture. It was a photo of Dia. Not one of the old photos they had taken together, but a recent one, taken just a few days ago, it seemed. She was smiling, her arms wrapped around someone, her head resting against theirs. A man. The sight of it hit him harder than he had expected. A sharp sting shot through his chest, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. He stared at the picture, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. It wasn't that he hadn't known she would eventually move on. It was the finality of it. The certainty that she had found someone else, someone who could give her the things he couldn't. The emotions that washed over him, anger, jealousy, sorrow, felt too big to contain. But all of it was overshadowed by one simple, undeniable truth. She was gone. She had moved on. And he had to do the same. He turned off his phone and stared blankly at the screen, trying to keep the tears at bay. It was foolish to think that it would have been any other way. Their time together had been beautiful, but it was always going to be fleeting. Their love had been like a shooting star, brief, intense, and then gone. That evening, as Arjun walked back to his dorm, the world seemed to shift. The air felt crisper, the sky clearer, and even the distant hum of the city seemed softer, as if it had been waiting for him to finally let go. It wasn't a moment of sudden realization or epiphany. It was quieter, more gradual, like a breath that had been held for too long and finally exhaled. He had loved Dia with all his heart, and even though it had ended in pain, that love would always be a part of him. But it was time to let it go. To step into the future without looking back. The next morning, Arjun woke early and packed his bag for the day. He grabbed his coat and, without thinking, walked toward the park. One last time. The streets were still covered in remnants of snow, but the warmth of the day made the air feel more like spring. He made his way to the bench where they had first confessed their feelings for each other, where their love had begun and where it had ended. He sat down, the memories flooding back with every passing moment. It was here, on this very bench, that they had laughed, cried, dreamed of a future together. And now, it was just him, sitting alone, the echo of their shared moments reverberating in his mind. Arjun closed his eyes, taking in the familiar sights and sounds, letting everything wash over him. It hurt. It always would. But he understood now that pain was part of the healing process. He could never forget her, but he didn't have to keep living in the past either. As the wind blew through the trees, Arjun stood up, leaving the bench behind. He walked away, the weight of the past lifting just slightly with each step. There was no dramatic closure, no sweeping declaration. There was just the simple act of moving forward. Dia had once been his whole world, and now she was a memory, a beautiful one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. But he was ready to make space for new memories, for new experiences, for a future that didn't depend on the past. And as he walked down the familiar path toward his future, Arjun realized that sometimes letting go wasn't about forgetting. It was about making room for something new. The story ends here, with Arjun beginning to find peace in letting go of what he can never have. He steps into the future, knowing that the love he shared with Dia will always be a part of him, but that he must move on to create new experiences.